The Last of Us is premiered on HBO Max to rave reviews. A large number of those reviews made a point to emphasize its origin in video games. The BBC rushed to label it the best video game adaptation ever. The New Yorker asked, "Can a video game be prestige TV?" Articles were written, by me, contextualizing The Last of Us in the long and storied history of bad video game adaptations. At this point, Hollywood has spent decades trying to figure out how to adapt video games to other media, and the results haven't exactly been inspiring. Video game movies date back to the mid-1990s at the latest, with the release of Super Mario Bros. In May 1993. A slew of releases followed, from Double Dragon, to Street Fighter, to Mortal Kombat Annihilation, to Wing Commander, to Lara Croft Tomb Raider, to Resident Evil, to Lara Croft Tomb Raider The Cradle of Life, to House of the Dead, to Alone in the Dark, to Doom, to Blood Rain, to Silent Hill, to DOA, Dead or Alive, to Resident Evil Extinction, to Postal, to Hitman, to In the Name of the King, A Dungeon Siege Tale, to Far Cry, to Max Payne, to Street Fighter, The Legend of Chun-Li, to Tekken, to Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, to Resident Evil Afterlife, to Resident Evil Retribution, to Silent Hill Revelation, to Need for Speed, to Hitman Agent 47, to Warcraft, to Assassin's Creed, to Resident Evil The Final Chapter, to Tomb Raider, to Rampage, to Dead Trigger. I think you get it. It took a quarter of a century for a video game movie to earn a positive score on Rotten Tomatoes, with Pokémon Detective Pikachu in May 2019. Even then, positively reviewed video game movies were rare. Those films that did earn net positive scores, like the two Sonic movies, hardly earned raves. It's worth pausing to acknowledge why video games didn't always translate well to the cinema screen. Many of the early adaptations, like Super Mario Bros. Or Street Fighter, were platformers and beat-em-ups. They weren't video games especially renowned for their deep character work or complicated plot mechanics. They were extremely visceral experiences. It is impossible to emulate the thrill of jabbing the controller and smashing the buttons while playing Double Dragon. As with any active adaptation, it's important to understand that different mediums come with different attributes, and that translating directly from one to another without understanding the unique attributes of either is a recipe for disaster. The most successful of these early video game adaptations, like Paul W.S. Anderson's Mortal Kombat, worked because they understood that these were films rather than video games, and so drew from movies that had perhaps inspired the video games themselves, like Enter the Dragon. This carries through to the present day. If you look at well-reviewed video game movies, like for example Pokémon Detective Pikachu or Sonic the Hedgehog, those aren't really video game adaptations, at least in terms of plot. Instead, they're more homages to existing films. For example, Sonic the Hedgehog is very transparently a reskinning of the movie Hop. I mean, it's such a classic, they even kept James Marsden. Pokemon Detective Pikachu is basically a hybrid of Chinatown and Get Out, but with Pokemon IP on top of it.
Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown.
Many of the best video game movies have not been direct adaptations of existing works like Lara Croft Tomb Raider or Hitman. Instead, they've been movies that are less interested in the specific trappings of a given game and more interested in dramatizing the underlying dynamics. Edge of Tomorrow, or Live, Die, Repeat, or All You Need Is Kill, comes to mind as an example of a video game-inflected movie that has nothing to do with video games, in that it is an action movie that is built around the premise of save scumming, where a player moves through a level by incrementally progressing a saved game. Or the Wreck-It Ralph and Jumanji movies, which are based around fictional video games and so don't have to worry about lore. Still, even allowing for all of this, film has always been a challenging medium for video game adaptation. Video games are an art form that are built around the audience's agency and participation in shaping the narrative, while films render the viewer as a passive observer. Even beyond that, as video games become more complex and elaborate, they grew in stature and scale. As they became both more plot-driven and more open-world, they grew larger and crucially longer. Immersion is key to many successful and high-profile video game properties. The idea of the player literally throwing themselves into a fictional world. Sometimes that literally means a map that the player can explore on their own time and on their own terms, forging a complicated series of relationships and developing a variety of long-term setups and payoffs. Even in more conventional and linear video games, it means progression through a variety of worlds and settings, environments, and dynamics. Modern AAA games take a long time to play. It's hard to get exact statistics because playtime and the definition of complete vary from player to player. However, it takes an average player 44.5 hours to complete the story in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, 50 hours to complete the story in Red Dead Redemption 2, 51 hours to complete the story in The Witcher 3, and so on. Sure, a lot of that might be wandering, walking, and fetch questing that can be cut from a less interactive adaptation, but it's still a lot of time to spend in that world. To be fair, there are some critics who would argue that these modern games are too long. Former PlayStation executive Sean Layden has argued that the cost of development on these titles has spun out of control. Even then, Layden's argument for, quote, tighter, more compelling content, unquote, still extends to between 12 and 15 hours. That is several magnitudes longer than the average feature film, even allowing for the indulgence of films like Zack Snyder's Justice League or Babylon. It's about the same as the amount of time one feels they've lost watching something like Thunder Force. And yes, I know Thunder Force is only technically like 80 minutes long, but I feel like part of me is still watching Thunder Force. Anyway, movies can create that level of immersion. However, they tend to require an incredible creative talent and an extended runtime, often across multiple movies. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy were a singular accomplishment, often feeling like a travelogue of an imaginary world. The combined extended cuts of those movies land right in Layden's sweet spot, running over 11 hours. However, Hollywood, and yes, Jackson himself, has spent decades trying to replicate that original triumph, with limited success. It can even happen with original works. Whatever one might think of the actual quality of James Cameron's 2 Avatar movies, they do spirit the viewer away to the imagined world of Pandora. However, James Cameron is an exceptional directorial talent. It should also be noted that Cameron's pushing the limits of the form and subscribes to Layden's ideas about length. The current cut of Cameron's 3rd Avatar movie, for example, clocks in at 9 hours, and he wants to complete the VFX on it. However, it's easy to see why films have struggled to create the sense of immersion that video games take for granted. The Last of Us suggests that Hollywood might have been trying to translate these games into the wrong medium, that film was never going to be a satisfying format for any expansive adaptation of even a mid-level game. It is difficult to establish a single setting in that time, let alone to build an entire world at a level of detail that video games require. The Last of Us suggests that television is a form much more suited to this sort of storytelling and world building. After all, the ideal modern streaming show runs for about 30 episodes. Popular prestige television runs a little longer, but not much. The Sopranos had 86 episodes, Game of Thrones 73 episodes, The Wire 60 episodes. Seasons have gotten shorter, and budgets have gotten bigger, and television has increased flexibility in how to tell its stories over a given length. The emergence of streaming and prestige television made it possible for shows to end on their own terms, rather than running until the ratings drop low enough to make cancellation economically appealing. We have no plans to tell any stories beyond adapting the games, writer Craig Mazin told The Hollywood Reporter before the premiere of The Last of Us. When it becomes a perpetual motion machine, it just can't help but get kind of stupid. Endings mean everything to me. Even over its 9-episode first season, The Last of Us benefits greatly from having the sort of space that a movie simply could not afford, whether in terms of structure or in terms of runtime. The show progresses linearly, following Joel and Ellie on their journey westward from Boston. There is clear progress made as the season unfolds. The characters reach different locations and accomplish particular goals, but there is always more to do. It is simplistic to suggest a direct correlation between the television episode and the video game level as a unit of narrative, particularly as many video games allow players to replay the levels they've already beaten or to revisit locations where they've already been. Still, it's a structure that maps neatly enough onto television. In many of these great games, the world grows gradually larger, and the dynamics grow gradually more complex as the player works through them. The same is true of great television. It may be reductive to suggest that the reason that players come to care so much about Joel and Ellie in The Last of Us is because they spend on average 15 hours with the pair. After all, there are plenty of other factors to consider, such as the writing or the performances from Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson, not to mention other details like Gustavo Santaolla's score. Indeed, the entire premise of movies is that it's possible to care deeply about characters after spending far less than 15 hours with them. To pick an obvious example, it doesn't take me longer than the opening 10 minutes of Up to come to care deeply about Carl and Ellie. Still, having that amount of time changes the audience's relationship to the story and the characters. It's possible for the player to develop empathy for these characters in different ways than they would in a 2-hour feature film, perhaps more subtle and perhaps more nuanced. Trying to cram that dynamic into a conventional 3-act movie would require a lot of changes and a great deal of skill. In contrast, a television show can more comfortably emulate the rhythms of that relationship.
How much longer?
5-hour hike.
We can manage that.
Hollywood spent decades trying to crack the formula for the perfect video game movie. The Last of Us makes a very compelling case for television as a far more suitable format. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was In the Frame.